Hello everyone and welcome to a video discussing DBQs for AP History. This video should be basically applicable to all content that is up to date to the year 2022 for AP World, APUSH, and AP European History. And the purpose of this video is not only to discuss, how to write a DBQ, but also what a DBQ is, what it looks like, and basically give you a familiarity with the actual topic and the way you write before you actually write a DBQ in your own class and maybe jeopardize your grade, or before the AP test and you need a refresher. So, there are several parts of this video, and I will be leaving timestamps in the description, so if you need to use that to kind of get the most specific part of the video out, there you go. And with that being said, I'm going to continue with the rest of the video. Anyways, so what is a DBQ on the test for the AP United States, AP World, or AP European History test? The DBQ is a document-based question. Basically, it gives you a prompt, a question, and several documents, evidence to support what you have to make as a claim from the question asked. Okay? Now, in each version of AP History, they look at a different year, right? So they're not going to test you on the entirety of the content, rather one specific topic, and they don't generally cover most of the actual curriculum. It typically starts around Unit 3 or Unit 2 of the content. What do I mean by that? For example, look at AP World. AP World's DBQ starts between the years 1450 to 2001. Now, what are the odds that the DBQ is going to be about a topic in 2001 or the early modern century? Very, very low. What is the probability that it's going to be somewhere more in between there, like the year 1800, 1900? Much, much higher. Again, the DBQ writers for the AP test do not like making their DBQs from the beginning of the year and the end of the year because there's very limited resources, and that's also typically when students kind of check out and when they're learning. They want to give people leeway. So you're going to be most likely prioritizing topics between Unit 3 to Unit 8 of your content, or Unit 9 as well, to really make sure that you know what the DBQ is going to be about. You got to focus on those units. The same is applicable to APUSH. If you read right here, 1754 to 1980, I took APUSH last year. 1754 is basically Unit 3, and 1980 is Unit 9. The same is applicable to European history. 1600s is the Protestant Reformation. 2001 is the last unit. Protestant Reformation is Unit 3. So, with that being said, why is the DBQ so important? Why is it necessary to make a video about it? Well, not only can it be a daunting thing to face, as it is the largest part of the AP test, but it is also well, not the largest part, rather, it is the second largest part, but it is the most complex portion of the most complex portion of the AP test. It requires different types of skills to kind of bring together all in one to produce something that is pretty valuable in content. Alongside that, you are given a relatively short period of time to write it. You are given typically 60 minutes, and albeit 60 minutes may not be enough sometimes for people to write their DBQs, but you shouldn't fear, because when you are provided the DBQ, and I want to reiterate this one more time, when you are provided the DBQ on the actual AP test, you will receive 100 minutes, and you can, because, well, you receive 100 minutes, but you have to write a DBQ and a long essay question, which I covered in another one of my videos, together in that time period. However, you can allocate that time differently. Let's say the recommended time for the DBQ is 60 minutes. Maybe I need 70 minutes to write my DBQ because I want to really, really kind of knock the content out of the park. I can do that, but I'm only going to have 30 minutes left for the LAQ. And this works vice versa. If I want to spend 50 minutes on the LAQ and 50 minutes on the DBQ, I'm totally free to do that. Another question that typically pops up on the AP test is, look, there's a 15-minute reading period and a 60-minute entire recommended time. What do I do in that 15-minute reading period? Well, they advise you to read, but typically, if I were you, I wouldn't use that entire 15 minutes. I'd actually get straight to writing as fast as I can, because at the end of the day, this is the second highest part of your AP test. It is about 25% of your score. And I would like to note this as something significant, because if you do well on the DBQ and the MCQs, you have basically guaranteed yourself a 4 at that point. And when I say well, I mean you don't have to like get 100% on this, but if you get around, like, let's say a 90% on both portions of the test, you have gotten yourself a 4 and you can kind of slack off at the end of the LEQ, or you can slack off at the end of the SAQ. So if you really, really want to ensure a solid grade on your AP test, you want to do really good on the MCQs and you want to do damn good on the DBQ, because this is where the meat of your grade is going to be. Anyways, with that being said, let us now kind of continue with the type of questions you're going to see on the AP test. On the AP test, they have recently started to only use two types of questions, which is evaluate the extent and rank the relative importance. I list evaluate the extent first because it is the easier amongst the two. A lot of kids actually get tripped up around rank the relative importance. Anyways, with this type of question of evaluate the extent, what does it mean? Well, it basically just means look at the degree to which this makes an impact. For example, the first prompt is from APUSH. Evaluate the extent to which the progressive movement fostered political change in the United States from the period of 1890 to 1920. Okay, what is this trying to say? Well, if I want to translate it in what I just said, it basically means to what degree did the progressive movement make a change? Okay, in the simplest words possible. And in all of your DBQs, you will be provided a time period as well. A time period and a type of way you're going to have to analyze things. Okay? Time period is important because you want to stay in that time period for the majority of your essay. There are exceptions to that, which I will continue in the rest of the video or talk about. There is also another thing called rank the relative importance, where you basically have to make a list. A, B, C, or 1, 2, 3. This was important because of X. And then you have to not only show why one thing was important, but why it was more important than another event. That's why this essay or this essay topic is very, very tricky for students, because instead of merely just analyzing what happened in history, like why is this important, you have to analyze kind of two things at once. Analyze like a deeper cause maybe, or perhaps a more fundamental cause, and I will explain on that in the rest of the video. I have an entire portion on how to write a DBQ. So I'm just trying to make everyone familiar here with the types of stuff you're going to see. So what will you actually see on the DBQ? I have a few DBQs pulled up here from previous years. This is the one for APUSH. And as I've listed here, you will have 5 documents with quotes. These are legitimate historical quotes that have been created by historical figures. Okay, so these are real stuff. And you will have 2 quotes that have photos, graphs, charts, maps, etc. Okay, and just to make you familiarize with it, this is what the legitimate test looks like. You will have an hour and 40 minutes to do everything, which is 100 minutes. And you will basically just get this DBQ prompt first. Document 1. Here's a quote by President Roosevelt. Document 2. Here's a quote by property. Well, it's a property deed, so it's a little bit different. But you get the point at this point. Like there are legitimate quotes that you have to go and read about and analyze. Now, this seems like a load of material that they're just dumping at you, and quite frankly it is, but there are tricks to kind of maneuvering past this so you don't actually have to read, I don't know, like 3,000 words in one DBQ. But again, point. Look, there is another quote here, but then they give you a map, and that map is significant because it is one of the easiest ways you can get a point. Anyways, so like I said, this is like kind of a photo. It's an advertisement, so you can kind of think of that as art. But with that being said, that is what the DBQ looks like. That is what you will see on the test. This is not like they don't really mix around. The AP test makers are pretty predictable with this stuff. So you will have 5 documents with quotes from some historical figure or some historical event, and you will have 2 documents that are either a photo, graph, chart, map, etc. Typically, photos or art is going to be more towards a older period of time, because people didn't have photos, of course, and graphs are also going to be a little bit more towards an older period of time. They like to use maps for more modern periods, and definitely photos, of course, for modern periods of time. So that's what the test looks like. Now let's look at how they actually grade your test on the AP rubric. Now, I would like to preface this part by saying that every teacher is different with the way they want to grade you. But when it comes to the AP test, they are consistent. And the way they are consistent is that it's just a 0 or 1 point system. You get the point or you don't. There is no in between. I know some teachers do some in betweens like a 0.5 or a 0.75, but that is not how it is on the AP test. Okay? So, what are the criteria that they are looking at for you to pass this test? 1. contextualization. I don't really want to read what it says here, but for a very brief summary, contextualization is a summary of the historical events that are relevant to the prompt. What do I mean by that? If you recall, the DBQ prompt that I had showed you is about the progressive era. I will scroll up here for a quick glance about the progressive era. So a context that would be relevant to that would be talking about political changes that led to the progressive era. So a general summary, if you will. I would also advise you to do some analysis in that summary, but it's not a necessity. I just want people to kind of go above and beyond so they really secure every point. Contextualization is somewhat of a easier point to get on the AP test, but I would still say it's at a mediocre. Like at least half the students get the contextualization point. Next is the thesis point. The thesis point must be the easiest point to get. It has to be. Most students always get the thesis point. Really, it's just make a defensible argument that is relevant to the prompt provided to you. So the only way you're going to lose on this thesis point is if you don't answer the prompt correctly. So if it's talking about, history from 1910 to 1920, and I talk about the 1600s, they're going to probably say this kid's crazy, so they would not give me the point. And lastly, you have evidence. Well, not lastly, my apologies, but the next piece of thing they're going to be testing you on is evidence. And there are two ways they're going to be looking at it. One is use the content of at least 3 documents to address the topic of the prompt. I will talk about how you do this stuff, but basically just use 3 documents. Number 2 is support an argument in response to the prompt using at least 6 documents. In order to get this, you're going to have to do a little bit more extra work. You're going to have to put some more analysis into what you're doing, but you should still be, it's relatively easy to get these 2 points right here, and I'll explain why later in the video. Lastly, it's evidence beyond the documents. For evidence beyond the documents, you actually have to use outside information. What I mean by that is you can only use, for the most part of your analysis, the documents provided in this portion right here. I can only talk about President Roosevelt's signing of the GI Bill. I can only talk about the property deed, so on and so forth. But what the DBQ actually allows me to do for one part of my essay, only for one part, and it's a very minuscule part, is to talk about another factor that was present historically at the given time period. You must stay within the range of the prompt. Within that given time period they provide you, and with relevance to the prompt, I can talk about something that is not provided within the documents and explain how it contributed to some type of way for the prompt. So, if it's about the progressive era and they gave me 7 documents, I can use an outside information, or I can think outside of the box and say, oh, well, this is something that is not in the document that are provided to me, and I believe that it will contribute to my argument as a prompt, or to the prompt. My apologies. So, those are the 3 things that they really care about for your evidence, and the last 2 is going to be about analysis and reasoning. The first type of analysis is basically showing why is this historical event important. So you're really going to be focusing on cause and effect analysis here. That is the best way I can recommend it for you. And the next one is called APCP or APSP, depending on the teacher you have. And APCP is really just using 4 things. You identify the audience of the document, or the perspective of the document, the point of view of the document, or the context or situation of the document. What do I mean by that? I use these factors to further develop my point. So if I were to give you an example, and I want to talk about the audience of document 5 of this, you don't even have to read it. I would read document 5 and I'd say, oh, this document is catering towards this group of people. All right? And then I would explain why that is significant. Okay? If I want to talk about context, I would read this and I'd say, oh, it's a property deed for a family in 1947. Then I would talk about the context in which this document becomes relevant. What basically caused this document to be? And typically you're going to notice that there's kind of this gray area between just regular analysis and this APCP type of analysis. They're basically the same thing. You just have to reword your things differently. And if you're smart enough, which I will try to get at in this video, if you're smart enough, you can actually kind of merge the two and do less work. I'd also like to note that when a lot of students say like, hey, how many sentences should I have for each of these? I know people hate it, but realistically speaking, it's at as much as you need to prove your point. But typically, with the given time frame you are provided, you should be able to write a contextualization, and I'll put it here, in about 3 to 4 sentences. 3 to 4 sentences. Um, sentences. I think I spelled that wrong. I don't care. I'm just going to say sentence. And then a thesis should be 1 to 2 sentences. Your documents. So I want to say between 1 to 2 sentences, and I'll explain how you talk about your documents. Your outside information, 2 sentences typically. Your analysis, 2 sentences. Your APCP, 2 sentences. Your historical connection, I would say 4 sentences. Okay? And I will explain why for each of these as we kind of get more and more closer to the way you write each portion. Anyways, with that being said, let me just kind of preface a few more things about the structure of your DBQ. For the structure of your DBQ, you are not necessarily required to write about all 7 prompts. You can if you want, but if you want to get the opportunity, not saying that you will, but if you want to maximize your score to the highest value, you must use 6 out of the 7 documents. 6 out of the 7. So that gives you leeway to kind of just drop one if you feel uncomfortable with it. Okay? So let's say I don't really want to talk about this map in my essay, but I still want to include all other parts of the document, then I will probably have to end up, dropping that map document and just using the other 6. So that is kind of like a nice thing the College Board does. They kind of give you a little bit more leeway, but remember, you can still use 7. And honestly, I would suggest you, if you have the time, to do 7 because it's just going to look better. Let's say you mess up on one of the analysis on the documents, you have kind of a crutch for the next. Next up, APCPs. You are required to do 3 APCPs on the AP test, but I recommend doing 4. If you do 2 APCPs, you will not get the point for APCPs at all. You automatically lose it. If you get 4, well, you're automatically gonna, be considered for that score. And the reason I say do 4 APCPs if you can is because of the following reason. Let's say one of your APCPs sucked, right? So now you only have 2 valid APCPs. If you have 2 valid APCPs, you're also not going to get the point. Each APCP that you do must be contributing to the document, okay? So if you have 2, you're going to lose. But let's say you do 4 APCPs and only one of them sucked, right? Because you were uncomfortable with your APCP. You will then still get the point because they would still consider every APCP you have done. It's an APCP way too many times, but I hope that makes sense. And lastly, evidence. If I do not use 6 documents, if I use 5, I will automatically lose 1 point for using an argument that has at least 6 documents. I can still get the point for using 3 documents, but I will not get the point for using at least 6. Okay? So remember, 7 documents doesn't matter, but it's recommended. 4 APCPs is recommended, but it's not needed. You only need 3. But if you go any time below that threshold, you will lose points. So always try to get 3 APCPs done. Okay? 4 recommended though. Alright? So that is kind of the structure of everything. Now let's kind of talk about how you approach writing each of these portions of the essay. Number 1, your context. The context, like I said, is really just the summary of it all. But it's beyond summary. If I were to give an analogy to it, it's like your first introduction. And it is very important to get this right. Because if you show to the people that, hey, I'm a pretty good writer, they're going to be hooked in and paying attention to your writing much more quicker or much more immediately than you typically would have in a regular essay. Additionally, the context should be something relatively easy to kind of get. It's a summary. Now, I don't want to say that this essay or the DBQ is a storytelling thing, but to a degree it is. The context is part of that storytelling. The context is where you can give a summary, but I would still suggest giving analysis. And what do you really try to put in your context? Now, I've said this in my LAQ video, but I'll say it again here. For your context, you want to do at least 2 things if necessary. Number one is when you are going to write your context, look at the prompt you are given and try to identify keywords in this prompt that an average person who does not understand history will get. Now, what do I mean by that? If I were to look at this prompt of evaluate the extent to which the progressive movement fostered political change in the United States from 1890 to 1920, I have no idea what the progressive movement is as a reader who has never understood history. I'll bring you another example. Evaluate the extent to which economic factors led to the outbreak of the Mexican Revolution. I wouldn't know what the Mexican Revolution is. So this is the perfect point to really just kind of stress that you understand what you are talking about. So how would I introduce what the progressive movement is, or how would I introduce the Mexican Revolution? All right, because I always want to talk about the keywords that I'm supposed to be provided within my essay. What I would do is this three-step method that I've kind of generated. It is the cause, define, and analyze the effect of method. If I were to look at the first prompt about the progressive movement, I would start by saying the cause of the progressive movement was XYZ. Okay? And I would maybe go into another sentence explaining what XYZ are and how that led to the progressive movement. Then I would explain what the actual progressive movement is. It was a movement between 1890 to 1920 in which Americans became much more socially liberal, not liberal, sorry, economically liberal, because they were funding government businesses were being broken up as monopolies were being destroyed, blah 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 blah. My apologies, kind of stuttered on my words there, but you get the point. You define what it is or what people should expect of it, and then you talk about one sentence of the effect of it. The progressive movement did this. So cause, define, and explain. Now, this doesn't necessarily always work on every contextualization. For example, I would argue that for this prompt right here, it is a pretty good explanation on why defining key terms wouldn't work, because you don't really have anything that people wouldn't be able to understand if you assumed they were dumb. Evaluate the extent to which economic growth led to changes in the United States society in the period from 1940 to 1970. That's kind of hard to really talk about in keywords. So instead of identifying keywords in the prompt and trying to talk about what those keywords are, I would suggest doing the next type of analysis or next type of contextualization writing. And that is kind of going backwards in time from when the prompt was. So if it's 1940, I would go back to 1930 or 1920, and I would look at one aspect of what the prompt is asking me. What do I mean by that? Or, sorry, one historical aspect. What do I mean by that? Well, if the prompt is talking about politics, I would go back a few years before the year or the time period they've provided me, and I would go back and I'd say, okay, what was it like then? Okay? And I would explain those conditions, and I would talk about how those conditions led to the current time period. It's somewhat similar as a cause and effect thing, right? You are still saying that these old conditions of the past, before this time period, would have been basically causing this time period to happen, blah, 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 blah. So, in particular, what would I look at? For this prompt, I would look at the United States society in the period before 1940, or yeah, the period before 1940, and I would also look at the causes of the economic factors that led to the changes in the 1940s to 1970s. So it's kind of like a two-pronged thing, but you still have to tackle both of them, and that's why I say the contextualization should be around 2 to 4 sentences, a much more heavier part of what you are writing about. I would typically stick with 4. I go to 6 sentences because I really want to make sure that I kind of you know get it done with and really kind of like leave a good mark, because again, this is the first thing people read. So that's kind of it for those two things. So again, remember cause, define, and effect for things where they have key terms. And what do I know? How do I know what a key term is? Again, if it's some historical word that the average population may not be familiar with. If that fails you, go to the next thing. Look at what aspect of history the prompt is asking you about. Is it society? Is it politics? Is it economics? In the case of the second prompt that I showed you, everyone, was society and economics. What do? Take a step back to the time period before and explain the society and economics of that time period, or really whatever factor, whatever historical factor you're supposed to be talking about in the essay. Take a step back, look at it, and then go ahead and talk about, how those led to the concurrent conditions of the time period provided in your essay. Okay? So that's the contextualization. Um, Next up is the thesis. Thesis should be very easy. It's either in the beginning of your essay or at the end. And one thing that I'd really like to mention, if you can't do this, it's not the end of the world, but I would say that this is the best part to do it, is note where your thesis is. So after you write it, underline it with maybe well, you have to write in pen, but underline it maybe a different color. So I would recommend on the day of the AP test bring two colors, one black, one blue, and underline it in the opposing color that you've written in. And I say this because when you are making an argument, you want to make sure that argument that you have made is extraordinarily clear. If the reader has no idea what you're talking about, you may not even get the point for the thesis, and the thesis should be the easiest point to get. So, with that being said, underline it, and I will give you just a simple example of what I mean by that. Blah 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 led to blah blah blah, and then I'm on my computer so I can underline it. You can italicize it if you need, and honestly, if those kind of leave your memory, even write thesis after what you've written in brackets. You really want to make clear that you know what you are talking about. Okay, and the author needs to know what you are talking about to even grade you on the rest of your essay. Please do this, because the more clear you make your material or the things that you're talking about, the easier it is for the author, or not the author, but the AP test grader to grade you, and they may kind of become nicer. These are things that may make a student who's kind of on that borderline get to that 5 or get to the 4 that they need instead of a 3, and kind of be docked up for unreasonable points when they kind of did the work. Okay? So now that I've kind of told you how to annotate a thesis, let's actually talk about what the thesis looks like. So, what you always want to do in your thesis, I guess, for the easiest way to kind of talk about it, is restate the prompt. About the extent to which the progressive movement fostered political change in the United States from 1890 to 1920, always talk about the date. Say between 1889 or between 1890 to 1920, the progressive movement fostered political change via, and you would now make the argument. Okay? You would now make the argument in the way that it did, or it didn't, or it kind of did. Okay? This is the most important thing you should take away from writing a thesis or thinking about how to write a thesis. On your DBQ, remember, you are only restricted to a certain amount of documents, right? Now, the problem, and this is the dilemma that you're going to face on the DBQ, is to decide how you use those documents. And the only way you can use those documents appropriately is if your thesis is correct. All right, so you want these documents to be matched up with your thesis. The problem a lot of students face is that on DBQs, they try to trick you. They try to trick you because they will give you passages or photos that sometimes contradict one another. There's 7 documents, 3 documents might go one way, 4 documents might go another way, and it's your responsibility to pick and choose which documents you have to use for your essay. The beauty of the AP test is that you don't have to take a concrete stance. You don't only have to say it was this way or it was that way. You can say it was a little bit of X and it was a little bit of Y. Okay? So then you can use all of the documents provided, giving you maximum capacity to write about what you have. You have more writer's freedom, essentially. So you wouldn't have to stress about that. So if I were you, I would kind of always try to go in the middle unless you strongly feel a certain way. And remember, if you go in the middle, you also have more free room to talk about what you want for your outside information. And I know this isn't really related to the thesis, but if you mention in your thesis which way you're going to be going, that's how you have to use your documents. So this is why the thesis is super important. You've got to make sure when you look at your documents, you're just not going to say, oh, I'm going to take a concrete stance. Take a more fluid stance. Additionally, after kind of restating the prompt, what you should be doing is explaining the why. Okay? So evaluate the progressive movement's ability to foster change in the United States between 1890 and 1920. Explain why or how, right? So between 1890, so what I'd say is basically this. I would restate the date. It's always good to have that. Restate the prompt. And then explain how. or y. And what do I mean by that? If I were to if I were to respond to this prompt right here, how did the progressive movement make change? And of course, take a stance, and go in between if possible. That's just a tip. You don't have to. But if I were to write this now, I'd say the progressive movement between 1890 to 1920 fostered political change. And if you wanted to get really niche with it, you could talk about what type of political change by doing X, Y, Z. And not only doing X, Y, Z, but talk about what X, Y, Z did. So, you could list like by doing, or by, I'm not going to say doing, but by breaking up monopolies, right? That's kind of stating a fact, but which, and then you would explain how, right? That thing they did was important, right? Which increased people's economic autonomy, right? Um, that's kind of like an example. It's going to be a longer thing, but this is how you really ensure the point or this is how you really ensure that you got the point. Because if you talk about not only do you restate the prompt and you take a stance, but you also basically say through what way did they do such a thing, or through what way did X happen, and why that is important. And the why it's important is kind of talking about this part, which increased people's autonomy. That's why it's important why breaking up monopolies is important. So you want to somewhat actually introduce the evidence you're going to be using in your documents, okay? And the reason I also say that you want to take 1 to 2 sentences is if you're doing a two-pronged essay, right, one way and the other way, you use a sentence to go one way and the second sentence to go another way. The best tip I have for that is if it's between a time period in which the social or political or economic trends kind of shift, right? So let's say between the year 1900 to 1950, there's a massive political shift between like the years 1925 and 1930. I would say before this period it was like this, after this period it was like this, and I talk about that in the two sentences. That's just kind of how you use dates to support your thesis, but you can also say it in different ways as well, but those are just examples. Next up is your documents. The first three documents you use is extremely easy to get the point, and I'm going to teach you how to do it right now. The best way you can get the point for using three documents is read the topic sentence of your document. These documents can be very long, and I've never full on read one of these documents because it is going to be wasting my time. What I have done instead is I've read the first two sentences of the document and the last two sentences of the document. Typically, the ones that are larger is what I do it for. I will actually end up reading like a document this small. But for a document that is this large, what I will typically do is read the first two sentences of each paragraph to kind of understand the topic sentence, to see what the person is arguing. Additionally, what I would try to do is I would look at who wrote it and in what year, and then I would use my historical knowledge to put all those three things together. Oh, this is what they're arguing, this is the year that this is in, and this is the person. If I know who the person is, then I would know what type of bias they have, if they're politically conservative or if they're politically liberal. If I knew the date or the year that the passage was written in, that would also be pretty helpful because I would know what political or historical trend is happening that time. For example, if I were to have a document from the year 1820 or 1815, well, I would know that the Revolutionary War in France has just happened, or not, well, the French Revolution has just happened, and the Napoleonic Wars have as well. So I could assume that there's going to be much more of a liberal bias within the document, and if I would just read the first few sentences, I might get that. But also the person could affect the way the document is, right? Because then the person who is at that time may either support that document or may oppose it with the political trends that are happening at that time. So you have to really use those three in conjunction. It's kind of hard to do it when you have like McCall's magazine because you don't know who McCall is, so you're going to have to read the topic sentence or maybe more of the document to understand that. But for someone like Franklin D. Roosevelt, I know who that man is, and you will too if you're an A push because you read a lot about him for like an entire chapter or two. So you shouldn't really worry. The AP test doesn't try to throw at you random people. They do sometimes, but there are going to be documents where you're going to be familiar with the person, and you could kind of use this strategy to help you get this point of documents. Now, how do you get this point of documents? I just explained it. what do you have to write for this to get the 3 document point? A paraphrased summary of what the guy said. So you would just simply say, in, and this is what you say. So let's say in the statement of the signing GI Bills, in a statement regarding GI Bills, you would identify the author, President Roosevelt argues. You would kind of talk about like the tone of speech they use. So it's argue, inform, blah 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 blah. They would argue, and you would just say what he argues. It's literally that easy. That is how you get the point. Please paraphrase. Do not quote. You will lose the point if you quote. They want to see how well you can actually understand the summary of the document. So just say the name of the document, the author, the way they try to explain the thing, and then explain the document. That's basically it. There's not much else to this. That's why I say you only need 1 to 2 sentences. And you should basically be doing it for every document that you use. So if you use 6 documents, so be it. That's what you gotta do. Next up is your outside information. And really, this is like the easiest part of the test, or sometimes the hardest part of the test. The reason I tell you to kind of go for your thesis kind of in both directions is for the following reason. Because I'm going to have more leeway for my outside information as well. Not only can I use different documents kind of to support my claim, but I'm going to have the ability to use outside information from a greater source of knowledge, or a greater wealth of knowledge, if I of course did my history reading. So the outside information is literally just a cause. It is required for you to do analysis, by the way. You're not just going to state a fact. You're going to state a fact that is relevant to your prompt, but you would explain the cause of that fact and the effect of that fact, or how it contributes to the prompt. Okay, so if I'm talking about, well, if it, in a prompt like here, if I'm looking at all these economic factors, right? Let's say there's one more economic factor that impacted society that this DBQ did not talk about. I would then talk about the cause of that economic factor that I have found outside of these documents, and I will talk about its effect on society. That is all you need, okay? If that's a decent analogy enough using that prompt. There's not much really more to the outside information. Typically try to get this done in 2 to 3 sentences. One sentence should really just be the cause of it, a summary. The next 2 should be about really analyzing the document, because this is a little bit of a harder point to get because it requires some analysis, and you're actually going to notice that if you check on the weighting of the test and what percent of people get certain points, the outside information kind of tends to be a little bit harder to get than other points, but that's kind of about it. Alongside this, you're going to be expected to have topic sentences and a conclusion. I like to preface this right now. You are expected to have it, but you don't have to have it. You do not need a conclusion. You definitely do not need topic sentences, because look at this rubric right here. There is no point that it asks you to write a topic sentence, and there's no point where it asks you to talk about a conclusion. Okay? So just to make your life easier and kind of, understand things a little bit easier, if you're running out of time, do not do a conclusion, and do not do a topic sentence. Will they be helpful to your overall argument? Of course. But if you want to get everything down here, which sometimes for some people is a lot, do not do those 2 things. Okay? You're going to be saving yourself a lot of points and a lot of time. Alongside that, I believe you can go to the analysis now. And I kind of want to hit analysis with APCP. These are the points that are typically harder to get on the AP test. About 20%, 10% of the kids get it within that margin. And really the way this analysis works on the AP test is you are going to be looking at these documents, and you're going to be basically analyzing why they're important. And the easiest way I can recommend an individual to get this analysis point is explain the effect of the document. Or you can go the other way and try to identify the cause of the document. Now, if you do that, you're going to get more into APCP territory. But like I said earlier on in the video, APCPs and analysis kind of merge if you're smart with it. And this is how you can do it. Once you have explained what the document is, you explain its importance. Now, for example, Let's go back to the Franklin Delano Roosevelt quote. If I wanted to incorporate it, actually, well, if I wanted to incorporate an APCP and an analysis, I would do a cause and effect. I would actually, it doesn't matter the way you do your APCP, it's just as long as it's after you have provided the evidence. So your APCP can actually go after your analysis. Typically, it's unconventional to do it that way. I wouldn't recommend you, but you can. So if you want to kind of talk about the context or the cause of a document, you can do that first, and then you can talk about its effect afterwards, if that helps with your flow of your writing. If not, you would just simply talk about the effects. So right now, this is talking about the GI Bill of Rights. So in here, I would base for my document, I would probably talk about in its evidence when I'm introducing the evidence, I'd say Franklin Delano Roosevelt was talking about the GI Bill, and I would probably introduce how the GI Bill was written or why it was written. Then I would use that GI Bill and I would use my historical knowledge to understand, okay, why was the GI Bill significant, right? Because right now this is just telling me what the GI Bill does. That's where you're going to be talking about in your evidence. Okay, your evidence is really just a cause area, or and this is typically what other people do, and I suggest you do this version, is just explain what the document says. Um, but once you have gotten that, you would explain the effect of the GI Bill. Why is that GI Bill important? Okay, and you would try to relate it, of course, to your prompt. So when I say why is the GI Bill important, I would say why is the GI Bill important to society? Okay, that's about 2 sentences. It shouldn't be too difficult. Um, but what I also want to kind of mention at the very end is kind of know which lens you are going to be looking at for analysis. So if it's the economy that I want to be arguing about, and really there's only three things the AP test is going to be asking about: the economy, society, or politics. If it's the economy, if I have to analyze something about the economy, I want to see whether or not the economy grows because of a certain fact or if it decreases or shrinks because of a certain fact. Then I would apply that to how consumers are affected. Okay? These are just tips for analysis. I'm not telling you you have to do this, but this is the lens you should be looking at your documents to. So if it's about the economy, talk about how the economy grows, who gets the money, where does the money end up to, who benefits from the money. Okay? If you're looking at society, you would want to look at the following things: social class differences, right? Who is at the top because of a certain fact, or who is at the bottom because of a certain fact? How big is the gap between the rich and the poor, right? These are all things that you can analyze in history. Additionally, does the quality of life of people like get better or worse, right? These are things that you can always talk about regarding um, societal or economic, because the quality of life could be dependent on your economy as well. You have a good economy, you have people probably getting jobs, so their quality of life is going to be good, right? You could talk about that. So socioeconomic stuff are typically kind of bunched together. In politics, I would try to analyze things differently. Who has the power? What does that person do with the power? And most importantly, how does this person retain their power? Okay? Those are the things that I would want to look at. And when this person has power, how does it impact the people of a nation? Right? These are, and maybe not the people of the nation, but how does it impact the nation in and of itself? Right? These are all the things that you're trying to work around with. Okay? Um, but again, if you're talking about politics, focus on how people maintain their power. So if you have a document about, political indoctrination, you would always talk about how like indoctrination helps um, centralize authority, right? And that's how you can benefit, right? The person at the top can stay at the top. So that's just an example. And I'll explain how this kind of bleeds into the APCP right now. See, the APCP I would recommend you doing on certain types of documents because they're kind of tricky sometimes. First of all, I would recommend you doing context because context is the easiest way to get your APCP. Literally just say, oh yeah, the cause of this document is blah, 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 and analyze that cause. That's why I said that you could either talk about a cause of a document in its actual evidence or you could do it in the APCP. I would save it to the APCP. So, do the cause in the APCP. You want to talk about the cause of the Bill of Rights? You talk about it in the APCP. Boom. You could also look at this in a different way because you'd want to figure out, okay, where do I want to do an APCP for? Well, what's going to save you a lot of time typically is the following. maps, and photos. They're going to be your best friend on the AP test, okay? Because they're very easy to interpret typically until it's something like really stupid, then I wouldn't recommend doing that. But for the most part, like this is a national system of interstate defense highways. I don't even need to be in AP history to understand what it is as long as I look at the key and I look at, just the map. If I have, you know, uh, eyes really, and half a brain. So, what I would recommend you doing if you get a map or a photo, and most particularly art, this is the most important one, art, always do purpose. Because people draw things for a reason. The author draws things for a specific reason. And the best way you could talk about art or a photo is what that person is trying to accomplish. And typically, they want the people that are viewing that to agree with them. So I would literally give you a freebie way of analyzing a photo or art or a map. It is to indoctrinate people. And what you basically say for that is that the purpose of this document is to indoctrinate people. And then you explain how it succeeds in there. That is the most important part of the APCP. You don't merely just say the purpose of the document is to do X. You say the purpose of the document is to do X and it achieves this through blank, blank, and blank, and then you talk about how each component of blank contributes to it. So I'm going to do an example. The purpose of document 6 is to do X. X is demonstrated through blah blah blah, which helps, you know, fulfill. And you kind of just sometimes, do a little bit of a wrap up or a conclusion. You may be redundant. It's okay. Fulfill the purpose of helping explain Doc 6, something like that. It's kind of weak, right? Because I don't really know what document 6 is, but again, do not just stop at saying the purpose of this or the context of this is just that and say that's my APCP. They want you to show what exactly from that document contributes to, or what part of the context contributes to understanding the document, right? And that's why I say context is easier, because you don't really need to know what the document is, or you don't really need to read the document. If you just know the cause of the document and the effect of the document, you could write an APCP about the cause. You could write an analysis about the effect. So again, always do context if you can, or do purpose if you have a photo, maybe even audience, but I would not probably do point of view, because point of view is kind of stupid in my opinion. I'm not really going to get into the depths of it, but it's typically the hardest. If you feel comfortable with it, explain the point of view, but make sure you explain how the components of the document are going to impact to the point of view. Okay? Additionally, if you have art, right, talk about the artistic style and how it makes the people feel, because that's what art does, right? Art makes you feel a certain way. And if it makes you feel a certain way, you're going to do a certain thing, right? That is what the artist is trying to do. Explain the art style. Explain how the way things are distorted, maybe, or the way things are demonstrated or shown, kind of leads to the reader to feel a certain way. Okay, that's what you got to do. Um, Again, remember, do 4 APCPs, and again, for your APCPs, they could be about 2 sentences. Um, Typically 3, but 2 should be fine. I don't think the AP graders are that nitpicky, but if you have time, write more. If you don't, just stick to 2. That's the bare minimum. That's the bare bones of your essay. Lastly, you have a historical connection. A historical connection is basically the way to get this point called complex understanding, and it's part of the LEQ as well, where you basically get one portion of the prompt you're talking about, one historical part of that prompt, and compare it to another perspective of history, okay, that was similar and different. And you're basically going to be analyzing those two things. Now, for your similarities, don't get me wrong, you're going to be a little bit redundant with analyzing the current topic you have because you just spent 6 documents analyzing it, okay? But with the other topic you have, you want to be a little bit more nuanced. By the way, this is a very hard point to get. So if you don't have time on the AP test, do not bother doing a historical connection. Literally go and try to finish the rest of your essay, because that's where you are most likely going to get the points. This is if you have 5 minutes left, you can go and write the historical connection because it shouldn't be that long. I would recommend doing 2 sentences comparing similarities to 2 different historical events, one including the one that is part of your DBQ prompt, and the other one being from a different time period typically, and from a different area. What I recommend doing if you're an A push or an AP Euro is stick to the regions that you are. So if I'm in European history, I'm not going to be talking about Chinese history. If I'm in A push, I'm not going to be talking about European history or even easier Asian history. I would be only sticking to historical events that happen in different time periods within U.S. history. That's not always the case. You can always kind of go a little bit, further. You can kind of compare U.S. history to European history. It's okay, but the graders typically like it if you kind of stick within the context of the region that you were provided. Um, with world history, you have much more leeway because you're literally reading about the world, so you should be fine. I wouldn't really worry about that. But for European and US history, yes, please stick to European history if you're going to compare 2 different events. And please compare and contrast 2 different events from US history if you're in A push. With that being said, though, I would also refrain from doing events past the year 1995, maybe even the early 90s, unless the prompt goes to there. Typically, the prompt does go up to, or sometimes the prompt can go to 1990, but I really wouldn't pass that envelope because remember, the people that are grading your test have political biases. And if you say a politically charged statement, that might be game over for you. And the reason that it might be game over for you is because this is the last part of your essay. Note this because this is very important. Because it's the last part of your essay, it's the last thing they read, and that's your last impression. And if you want to leave a really poor impression on the reader, they may dock you back. You don't know how the grader is going to grade. They may go backwards, and they may go take a point off for what you did. You don't want to deal with that. You don't want to make them in a pissy mood. So, you talk about historical facts that were from the past. Okay? I understand people may be upset about this, but it is the best way to maximize your score. With that being said, though, I think it's best to always just compare and contrast things that were relatively close in time period, but not necessarily too far apart. And additionally, I would recommend, or some people kind of get this confused, but let's say I were to talk about an event that happened in the 1900s, right? In maybe Europe, I can compare that to an event that happened in the 1900s in Asia. And this is typically only for world history, by the way, not really for European or APUSH. So what do I mean by that? For APUSH, they're typically going to always focus on like the national government for your DBQs or the states, so you're not going to have much leeway to talk about different areas. But if I were to have European history and they were to talk about France in the 1850s, I can compare 1850s France to the 1850s like England. That's an acceptable historical connection. You can still do the same time period, but just a different region. But you cannot do the same region at the same period of time. You could do the same region in a different period of time. Like if I have to talk about the Abbasid Caliphate in the year of 1200, which by the way you won't in the AP test because it starts at the year 1450. But let's say I had to go back even further, and I started at the year 1200. And if I had to talk about the Abbasid Caliphate in the year 1200, I could compare it to the Abbasid Caliphate in the year 1300. Okay, just as long as it's not within the time period of the prompt. Um, that's really it for historical connection. Just remember, it's still an analysis. You still want to do cause and effect for each of your similarities and differences. But if you can't, I wouldn't even bother going to the historical connection. I would really just bother getting the rest of your essay done and doing the extra recommended things. So maybe doing that 7th document, or maybe getting that 4th APCP through if you really, really need to get all the points that you can to save your grade. And remember, you may get a 6 out of 7 on the DBQ, 6 out of 7. Remember that this test is also extraordinarily weighted. So while a 6 out of 7 may be technically mathematically below an A, you're still going to be getting an A on the test. It's like equivalent to like a 90%. So it's still a relatively good score. Like do not be disappointed if you get 1, even 2 points off from the AP test because they pull some shady stuff, but like so, you know, that's about it though. I hope this was helpful. I feel personally that I do a better comprehensive list on how to analyze things in history. Um, in my LEQ video, I did rush this one a little bit, but and if you need more tips, go to the LEQ video. But this is typically how your essay is going to be structured. Um, Oh, and one more final prompt, or one more final thing. I would like to kind of note how you should kind of write your essays. You're going to be using four body paragraphs. Actually, sorry, five, five body paragraphs. And this is how you're going to do it. Contextualization. Ooh, I spelled that wrong. Just context plus your thesis first body. Your second body can be your outside information. And really, the outside information can kind of go anywhere, by the way. Second body. Your third body is going to be your first three docs. Then it's going to be the next three docs for your next body. And finally, your historical connection. And your APCP in your analysis basically occurs after every document, right? Every document must have analysis to get your 6-point document analysis. And my apologies for not talking about that earlier in the video. Kind of a good thing to hit at the very end. The last part of your DBQ should be the historical connection. Then you have your next three docs, outside information, context. So we do third body. This is your fourth body. That is your fifth body. Fifth body. So if I were to pull up an example of a DBQ that I actually wrote, I will show you what I mean by that. So look at how I underlined my DBQ first of all. And then I had, and by the way, you do not have to make a DBQ as long as this, but look at how, this is my first or my second body paragraph. This is my third body paragraph, all the way down here. I made my outside information its own body paragraph, and then I made the historical connection here. I restated my thesis as a conclusion, but I didn't have to. I just had extra time. But yeah, that is how you write a DBQ. I hope that helps, and good luck.